Have you ever sat at your family's dinner table and wondered just for a moment what it would feel like to truly be seen? My name is Emily Porter, and if you've ever found yourself fading into the background, hoping for a glance, a word, or even just a smile that never came, you are not alone. My story begins on a chilly March evening in a quiet suburb of Minnesota, where laughter often floated past me like music played for someone else. I was the eldest daughter, dutiful, responsible, quietly folding my dreams into the napkins I set out each night. Around me, life spun on my father's voice booming as he told stories, my mother doting on my younger sister Julia, whose laughter always seemed to light up every room. I grew up believing that love was something you earned by disappearing, by making yourself useful, by taking up less space. I know now that some of you listening have carried this same ache tucked away behind polite smiles and perfect report cards. Maybe you were the one always picked last, the one whose birthday slipped by with little more than a passing hug, the one whose achievements were met with a distracted nod, or worse, forgotten altogether. In America, we are taught to value independence, but rarely are we taught what it means to be invisible inside our own homes. That lesson I learned early, and I learned well. And yet, this story is not just about pain, it is about transformation. It is about how a crisis cracked open all the places I thought were healed and forced me to choose between old wounds and new boundaries. It's about how sometimes the hardest person to stand up for is yourself. I want to invite you, before we step any deeper, to ask yourself, what would it mean to finally claim your place at the table, to stop shrinking, to speak your truth, even when your voice shakes? Over the next hour, I'll share not only my journey from feeling invisible to finding my voice, but also the stumbles, the self-doubt, and the unexpected kindness that lit my way. You'll hear about the family crisis that changed everything, the memories that haunted me, and the small, defiant steps I took to draw my own lines in the sand. We'll talk about the power and the pain of setting boundaries, and how the love you seek sometimes arrives in places you never thought to look. So if you've ever wondered whether you're too much or not enough, if you've questioned whether you deserve to be seen, heard, and loved just as you are, I hope you'll stay with me. This is not a story of blame, but of awakening. It's not about casting villains, but about reclaiming agency and choosing compassion both for others and for yourself. I can't promise you a fairy tale ending, but I can promise you this: by the time we reach the last page together, you'll know that invisibility is not your destiny. You'll know that you are allowed to take up space, and that the life you want begins the moment you decide to stand tall, even if you have to do it alone. Let's begin. Growing up in the quiet suburbs of Minnesota, I learned early that families have their own choreography, a dance of voices, glances, and unspoken roles that everyone somehow seems to know. Ours was no different. In our house, my father was the storyteller, the provider, the man whose laughter filled the rooms and whose opinions set the tempo for every conversation. My mother, gentle and efficient, orchestrated meals, kept the peace, and poured her warmth into the youngest, my sister Julia. And then there was me, Emily, the eldest. I was the one who never quite found her cue, always waiting at the wings, hoping someone would call me center stage. It's funny looking back how you can be surrounded by people and still feel like a shadow, visible only at the edges, present but unnoticed, loved perhaps but never quite celebrated. Some of my earliest memories are wrapped in quiet observation. I would sit at the dinner table, my hands folded, listening as my father asked Julia about her day at school. She would chatter about a drawing she'd made a new friend at recess, and everyone would smile. When it was my turn, the conversation seemed to drift, my words swallowed by the clatter of plates or a new topic someone else brought up. On my 10th birthday, I remember saving a slice of my own cake, hoping someone would notice, but by morning it was gone, eaten maybe or thrown out with the wrapping paper. I didn't cry. I simply learned to celebrate in silence. There were awards I brought home, spelling bees, and science fairs that ended up buried under mail or lost in a pile of bills. Julia's participation ribbons, though, always found their way to the fridge, shining bright against the white door. It's easy to convince yourself that none of this matters, especially when you're a child desperate for approval. I became an expert at blending in. If someone needed help, I was the first to offer. I cleaned my room without being asked, did my homework quietly, and learned how to listen more than I spoke. At parent-teacher conferences, I stood beside my parents watching them beam at Julia's art projects, while my own straight-A report cards were met with a pat on the shoulder and a reminder to keep it up. I told myself this was enough, that being good meant being easy, being helpful, being small. But deep down, I wondered what would happen if I took up space. Would anyone notice if I stopped trying so hard to please? As I grew older, these moments collected in my mind like stones in a pocket, small, heavy, and always there. At sleepovers with friends, I saw how their parents listened, really listened to their stories, asked about their dreams, and made time for just them. Once my friend Mia's mom made a point to cheer the loudest at our school concert, waving a homemade sign with Mia's name in glitter. That night, I lay awake thinking about the empty seats at my own recitals, the polite applause that never seemed to reach my ears. It wasn't that my parents didn't care. I truly believe they did. It's just that love, when divided unequally, can leave invisible bruises, the kind that ache in private, that linger long after the crowd has gone home. I don't tell these stories to cast blame or paint villains where there are none. Families are complicated, and parents, like children, are imperfect. My mother juggled 2 jobs to keep us afloat, and my father carried the stress of a world that rarely felt safe or forgiving. They adored Julia, but I think they expected more of me, not because I was less worthy, but because I was the easy child, the one they thought didn't need as much. It's a common story, one I've heard echoed in voices across community centers, book clubs, and support groups all over America. The eldest daughter, the quiet son, the child who disappears into good grades or chores, always hoping to earn a spotlight that never quite finds them. For years, I wore my invisibility like a badge. It made me reliable, mature, the one teachers trusted and friends confided in. But invisibility has a cost. It teaches you to question your own needs, to second-guess your desires, to settle for crumbs when you deserve a place at the feast. I see now that so many of us are walking around with the weight of being the strong one, never realizing how lonely that pedestal can be. If you've ever felt this way, please know you are not alone. Your feelings are real, your story is valid, and your longing for recognition is nothing to be ashamed of. Here's a truth I wish I'd learned sooner: the invisible child is often the one who holds the family together, quietly absorbing pain so others don't have to. But strength built on silence is fragile. The more I tried to shrink myself, the more the world asked me to disappear. It's a mistake I see often in women who juggle careers and caregiving, in men who swallow their pride for the sake of peace, and children who learn too soon that love must be earned, not given. The lesson here is gentle but important. You are allowed to want more. You are allowed to raise your hand to say, "Look at me," to believe you deserve to be seen. I often think back to those early years whenever someone tells me they feel selfish for wanting attention or validation. I remind them gently that visibility is not vanity. It's an essential part of being human. We all need to be acknowledged to feel that our presence matters. For me, learning this lesson was the first step toward change. It didn't happen overnight, and the journey was far from easy. But once you begin to notice the ways you've been made small, you start to dream of something more, a life where you are known, not just needed, celebrated, not just tolerated. And so with every stone of memory, every ache of longing, I started to gather the courage to step into the light. What I didn't know then was that the path to visibility would be paved with hard choices and harder truths. Sometimes the crisis that wakes you up comes not as a thunderclap, but as a gentle, insistent knock, one you cannot ignore. For me, that knock came when my family's world began to unravel, and I was called home not as a daughter, but as a savior. I had to decide, would I keep shrinking to fit the life they had chosen for me, or would I finally claim my own space at the table? That is where the real journey began, a journey that would test everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and the quiet power of being seen. It's strange how the call that changes everything rarely comes with warning. I was in my small Seattle apartment, the morning rain, drawing silver lines on the window, when my phone buzzed with Julia's name. It had been months since we'd spoken our conversations, usually brief tiptoeing around old hurts. But that morning, her voice shook as she explained, "Emily, things are bad. Dad lost his job 2 months ago, and Mom, she's been in and out of the hospital. The bills are piling up. I messed up Em. I trusted the wrong person with money." I listened as the world I'd built for myself brick by careful brick seemed to sway. Julia, once the golden child, sounded as small as I remembered feeling. In that moment, the distance between us, the miles, the years, the unspoken resentments collapsed into a single desperate plea. "Can you come home?" I wish I could say my first reaction was compassion, that I rushed to pack a bag and book the next flight. But honestly, my chest tightened with a mixture of fear, anger, and exhaustion. For so long, I had been the reliable one, the problem solver, the steady shoulder everyone leaned on. I wondered, why is it always me who gets the call when things fall apart? Why does Julia, who basked in our parents' attention for so many years, suddenly reach for the sister she used to overlook? I wanted to scream to say, "No, you figure it out this time." But even as my heart protested, I felt the old reflex stir the sense of duty so deeply woven into my bones that I hardly noticed it anymore. In America, we talk a lot about independence, about forging our own paths, but the truth is, family ties, no matter how tangled, have a way of pulling us back. That afternoon, I sat at my desk laptop open but mind elsewhere, weighing every possible response. I thought about all the people I knew who had faced similar crossroads, friends who'd dropped everything for a sick parent, colleagues who quietly sent half their paycheck, home neighbors who uprooted their lives for a sibling in trouble. There's an unspoken contract in so many families. When the alarm sounds, you answer no matter the cost. Yet no one ever really prepares you for the emotional math of it, the tally of old hurts, silent expectations, and what you must set aside to become the rescuer. I realized I was not alone. So many of us, especially women, are conditioned to believe that love equals sacrifice, and that to say no is to betray not just your family, but some unwritten moral code. Still, I couldn't ignore Julia's pain. Her story spilled out in fragments: Dad's layoff after 20 years at the same company, Mom's illness that drained not only energy but hope, Julia's attempt to fix things by investing family money with a college acquaintance who promised impossible returns. The word scam hung between us like a storm cloud. I knew in that instant that the crisis wasn't just financial. It was about trust shame, the collapse of old certainties. I thought of my parents, proud, private, and ill-equipped to handle this kind of vulnerability. My mother, who had once prided herself on keeping everything together, was now struggling to keep herself afloat. My father, once so steady, now drifting and withdrawn. And Julia, who had never really failed at anything, was suddenly facing consequences much bigger than a bad grade or a missed opportunity. The weight of their needs settled on my shoulders, familiar and suffocating. I wanted to help. Of course I did. But the fear was real. What would returning home mean for me? Would I lose myself again, slip back into the old pattern of silence and self-erasure? Could I offer support without becoming invisible all over again? These questions pressed at me with every heartbeat. I remembered the stories I'd heard in my support group, tales of people who'd given until there was nothing left, no savings, no health, no peace of mind. I didn't want to be another cautionary tale, but the guilt was overwhelming. It's a particular kind of pain to feel responsible for people who never learned how to care for you in return. Eventually, I booked a flight. I told myself it was just a visit, a chance to assess the situation, not a surrender to old habits. On the plane, I stared at the clouds and replayed conversations from years past. Julia's laughter at the breakfast table, my father's booming advice, my mother's endless lists of things to fix or buy. I felt both young and impossibly old. I promised myself this time I would help differently. This time I would not disappear. Coming home was surreal. The house looked the same: blue shutters, creaky porch swing garden overrun with wildflowers and weeds. Inside, though, everything had changed. The air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were bracing against bad news. My parents greeted me with weary smiles, lines etched deeper on their faces. Julia hugged me tightly, the bravado of our childhood replaced by a trembling vulnerability. For the first time, I truly saw her as someone capable of falling apart. That night we sat at the old kitchen table, the site of so many family rituals. Bills were stacked in neat, anxious piles. My father's hands shook as he described searching for work. My mother's voice faltered when she admitted how close they were to losing the house. Julia cried, apologizing over and over for her mistake. I listened, alternating between empathy and frustration, remembering all the times my own troubles had been met with little more than a nod. Still, I knew this moment wasn't about keeping score. It was about deciding right then and there who I wanted to be, not just for them, but for myself. Here's what I learned. Every family, no matter how picture-perfect, will face a breaking point. Crisis doesn't always look like fire or flood. Sometimes it's a slow unraveling of the ties that once held you together. The question isn't whether you'll be needed, but how you'll choose to respond. For me, the lesson was this: compassion and boundaries are not opposites. It is possible to help without losing yourself, to care deeply and still protect your own heart. The courage to return home was not about fixing everything, but about facing what I could and could not carry. As I drifted off to sleep that first night back, I wondered what would happen next. I knew that helping my family wouldn't be as simple as writing a check or giving advice. The real work would be in confronting our old patterns and finding a way to offer support that didn't come at the expense of my own well-being. The crisis had forced open a door I'd spent years quietly closing. On the other side was a new path, one filled with hard conversations, uncertain outcomes, and if I was lucky, the chance to finally be seen for who I truly was. And so, with a mixture of hope and dread, I braced myself for what was to come. Little did I know the hardest part would not be the crisis itself, but the old wounds it brought to the surface, the ones I had carried with me unseen all along. There's a strange silence that settles in when you return to your childhood home as an adult. The creak of the stairs, the faded marks on the wall that once measured our heights, they all seem smaller now, as if the house itself has shrunk with time. Yet the memories they hold feel heavier than ever. On my first morning back, sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, just as it did when I was 12, but I noticed things I'd missed before: family photos on the fridge, almost everyone with Julia front and center, her arms thrown around our parents, my own face often at the edge or missing entirely. It struck me not for the first time how the roles we play as children have a way of following us into adulthood, even when we try to rewrite the script. While my parents shuffled through bills at the table, I wandered into the living room. On the mantel, Julia's swimming trophy glinted next to her high school graduation picture. My own certificate from the state science fair was nowhere to be seen. I remembered the night I won that award. I'd come home bursting with pride, only to find my parents out with Julia at her school play. The note they'd left dinner in the fridge, "Congratulations," was taped to the oven, more afterthought than celebration. Back then, I'd convinced myself I was just being dramatic. But now, watching Julia's face light up as she described her latest job interview, I felt that old ache return, a reminder that some wounds don't heal with time, they simply sink deeper. It's a pattern I've seen in many families, not just my own. At the community center, where I sometimes volunteer, I've heard teenagers talk about being the forgotten child or the responsible one, their voices tinged with equal parts pride and resentment. One boy, Marcus, once told me, "I get straight A's and nobody notices, but if my sister gets a C, everyone throws her a party." He said it with a smile, but the hurt in his eyes was unmistakable. The truth is, children learn early what wins affection and what doesn't. And those lessons, whether spoken or not, become the blueprint for our adult relationships with others and with ourselves. For years, I told myself these things didn't matter. I poured my energy into achievement, good grades, good manners, good decisions, hoping someone would finally see me. The irony, of course, is that being the dependable one meant I was the least likely to get attention. In family systems, psychologists call this the invisible child effect, a phenomenon where the most self-sufficient child receives the least emotional investment precisely because they seem to need it least. Dr. Janet Blackwell, a family therapist I admire, describes it like this: invisibility is rarely about absence. It's about adaptation. The child becomes who the family needs, not who they are. Hearing those words in a workshop one summer made me cry in a way I hadn't since I was a little girl. Sitting with my family now, I found myself torn between empathy and anger. I could see how exhausted my parents were, how desperate Julia felt, but the part of me that longed for acknowledgement was louder than ever. Sometimes I wanted to blurt out every slight, every moment I'd been overlooked just to see if anyone would remember. Instead, I swallowed my feelings, defaulting to the peacemaker role I'd played my whole life. That's the thing about old wounds, they shape our reactions long after the initial hurt has passed. The desire to keep the peace, to make things easier for everyone else, is hard to unlearn, even when you know it's costing you. I began to notice these patterns everywhere, in the way I hesitated before speaking up, in how quickly I offered to take on more than my share of chores in my automatic. It's okay whenever Julia apologized. Old habits, like old wounds, have a way of resurfacing when we are most vulnerable. I watched myself slip back into the background, organizing bills, scheduling doctor's appointments, quietly solving problems, while everyone else argued or worried aloud. It was so easy to become invisible again. So easy, in fact, that I nearly missed the quiet resentment growing inside me, threatening to overflow. There's a lesson here, one I wish more people talked about. Our childhood roles are powerful, but they're not permanent. We are allowed to grow past them, to demand more, to question whether the stories we were handed are still serving us. This doesn't mean abandoning our families or refusing to help. It means recognizing when the old scripts are keeping us small and finding the courage to write something new. For me, the first step was simply noticing, paying attention to how the past was shaping my present choices and asking myself whether I wanted to keep living that way. I found unexpected comfort in small, honest conversations. Late one night after Julia had gone to bed, I sat with my mother over mugs of chamomile tea. The kitchen was quiet shadows pooling in the corners. For the first time, I told her how invisible I'd felt growing up. She looked at me with a kind of bewildered sorrow, as if she was hearing a language she'd never learned. "I'm so sorry, Em," she whispered. "I thought you were the strong one." In that moment, I realized how much of our pain comes from what is left unsaid, from the mistaken beliefs we carry about each other. Sometimes what hurts us most isn't what happened, but what we needed and never received. The next morning, as I packed my bag for another long day of paperwork and phone calls, I promised myself to keep this awareness close. I would help my family, yes, but I would not let old wounds dictate my worth. I would ask for what I needed, even if my voice shook. The past is powerful, but it doesn't have to be our prison. We can choose again and again to speak up, to ask for more, to believe we are worthy of love and attention, even if we have to teach others how to give it. With each day, I felt a little stronger, a little braver. The weight of old wounds was still there, but I was learning to carry it differently. Instead of letting it silence me, I let it remind me of how far I'd come and how much further I could go. The next challenge I knew would be setting real boundaries, not just for my family, but for myself. The courage to draw those lines would be the truest test of all. And so as the days unfolded and new crises emerged, I found myself standing at a crossroads. Would I keep carrying the weight of old wounds, or would I risk everything for a chance to finally be seen? If you've ever tried to draw a boundary with someone you love, you know it feels less like building a wall and more like standing in the middle of a storm, hands shaking, voice barely above a whisper. That's exactly how it felt the evening I sat my family down at the kitchen table and explained as gently as I could what I could and could not do for them. My father's shoulders tensed, Julia's lips trembled, and my mother looked away, eyes fixed on a crack in the countertop as if searching for an escape. I took a breath and told them I would help with advice, with research, with finding the right professionals, but I couldn't give them my savings or become the glue that held all the broken pieces together. It was the hardest truth I'd ever spoken out loud. For years, I'd believed that love meant saying yes to everything. I'd said yes to extra chores, to picking Julia up from parties late at night, to covering for my parents when they forgot a birthday or a parent-teacher meeting. I became the person who anticipated everyone's needs, who made herself useful, so no one would see how much she needed in return. But as I listened to Julia plead, her voice edged with panic and shame, I realized the cost of all those yeses. Every time I overextended, I shrank a little more, disappearing into the very role that kept me from feeling loved. I knew I couldn't do it anymore, not if I wanted to break the cycle that had defined my family for so long. Setting boundaries isn't just about saying no, it's about saying yes to yourself. But it's also about weathering the storm that follows. My father accused me of being cold, of forgetting everything the family had done for me. Julia wept, calling me selfish. My mother's silence was somehow the loudest response of all. The guilt was immediate, a familiar ache settling in my chest. All I wanted was to fix things to make everyone happy, to go back to the safety of being the good daughter. But I held my ground even as their disappointment crashed over me in waves. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat in the darkness fighting the urge to apologize for drawing a line that was long overdue. I remembered something my therapist, Dr. Nguyen, once told me. Boundaries are a kindness to yourself and to others. They teach people how to treat you. At the time, I hadn't fully understood her words. I thought kindness meant giving until you had nothing left. But as I lay awake, I realized kindness can also mean trusting others to take responsibility for their own lives, even when it hurts to watch them struggle. In American culture, we celebrate independence, but in practice, families often blur the lines between support and self-sacrifice. Too many of us, especially daughters and eldest children, are taught that love is something we prove by how much we endure. The next day, I went for a walk through the neighborhood trying to steady my nerves. It was spring, and the trees were budding despite the lingering cold. I passed Mrs. Allen, our old neighbor, who was coaxing daffodils into bloom along her fence. We chatted for a while, and she told me about her own daughter, now grown, who'd moved across the country and rarely called. Sometimes she said letting them go is the kindest thing we can do. Her words stayed with me all afternoon. I realized boundaries weren't just about protecting myself, they were also about giving my family the space to grow, to stumble, to learn from their own mistakes. Back at the house, I tried to explain my reasoning to Julia. I told her how proud I was of the way she'd always chased after life, how I admired her confidence even when it veered into recklessness. But I also explained that she needed to face the consequences of her choices, just as I had when I first moved out. She listened, tears streaking her cheeks, and finally nodded. "I don't want you to hate me, Em," she whispered. I hugged her tightly, promising that love wasn't the problem. It was the pattern that needed to change. It wasn't a perfect conversation, but it was honest, and sometimes that's the most we can hope for. I know now that one of the greatest gifts we can give ourselves and those we care about is the courage to say, "This is as far as I can go." Not out of spite, but out of respect for our own limits. It's a lesson I see so many people struggling with, especially in families where the lines have been blurry for generations. We learn to equate sacrifice with virtue, to measure love by how much pain we're willing to swallow. But real love is spacious. It breathes. It allows each person the dignity to be responsible for their own life, their own healing. That night, for the first time in years, I slept without the old heaviness pressing on my chest. My boundaries hadn't fixed everything. My parents were still struggling. Julia was still scared, and the bills were still there in the morning. But something in me had shifted. I felt a small but undeniable sense of relief, the quiet satisfaction that comes from honoring your own needs, even when no one else understands. I had drawn a line, and the world hadn't ended. If anything, it felt like the beginning of something new. The days that followed weren't easy. My family adjusted, sometimes resentfully, to my new stance. My father avoided me, my mother tiptoed around the subject, and Julia vacillated between gratitude and frustration. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dynamic began to shift. My parents started making calls to financial counselors, Julia applied for a second job, and together they found a way to chip away at the mountain of debt. I offered advice when asked, but I stopped swooping in to save the day. I learned that sometimes the greatest help you can offer is believing that others are capable, even if it means letting them fall. And with that, I began to sense the possibility of change, not just for my family, but for myself. Setting boundaries had forced all of us to confront the ways we'd relied on old roles and expectations. It was uncomfortable sometimes, painful, but it was also necessary. I realized I didn't have to carry every burden, and that my value didn't depend on how much I could endure for others. The next challenge would be even harder, learning to speak the truths I'd buried for so long, and finding the courage to say out loud what I had only ever whispered to myself. The time had come to break the silence, to finally give voice to all the hurts, hopes, and dreams I'd held inside. Only then, I sensed, could real healing begin for us all. There comes a point in every journey when silence is no longer safe, when holding in your truth starts to hurt more than letting it out. For me, that moment arrived on a gray, rain-soaked afternoon as I watched Julia struggling with yet another call from the bank. My parents whispered in the next room, their voices laced with worry and shame. The air was thick with all the things we weren't saying, every unshed tear and buried resentment pressing in from all sides. I knew if I didn't speak now, I might never get another chance. So heart-pounding, I called my family into the living room. We sat in a circle of worn armchairs and mismatched cushions, the same spot where so many birthday songs and Sunday games had unfolded over the years. But this time I was determined to say what had always gone unsaid. My voice trembled as I began. I need to talk about how things have felt for me growing up, and even now. At first my words came out haltingly, as if I were pushing through mud. I explained how I'd always felt invisible, how my accomplishments were brushed aside while Julia's smallest victories were celebrated. I described the loneliness of being the strong one, the ache of watching my needs quietly dismissed. I tried not to sound accusatory. I knew my parents had their own scars and burdens, but I needed them to understand how those patterns had shaped me and why I could no longer bear them in silence. I told them about the missed birthdays, the forgotten awards, the nights I spent wishing for even a single moment of real attention. It was hard to look at their faces. My mother's eyes filled with tears, her hands twisting in her lap. My father sat stone-faced, but I could see his jaw clench as he absorbed my words. Julia, always quick with a retort, was silent for once, her gaze fixed on the carpet. I half expected an argument, a flood of excuses, or even anger. But what came instead was something I never anticipated. Aunt Susan, my father's older sister, had dropped by to check in. She stood in the doorway, listening quietly, then stepped forward. "I saw it too, she said gently. All those years I watched Emily fade into the background while everyone praised Julia. I should have spoken up sooner." Her words landed in the room like a lifeline, proof that my memories weren't just shadows, that the truth I carried wasn't mine alone. The relief I felt was immediate but complicated. Sometimes validation from an unexpected corner is all we need to find our courage. Aunt Susan's admission broke the dam, and for the first time my parents really listened. My mother apologized, her voice breaking. She explained that she'd always assumed I was fine because I didn't cause trouble, a phrase that made me wince but rang painfully true. My father struggled to respond, but eventually admitted he'd focused so much on what he thought the family needed he'd overlooked who I really was. Julia, too, confessed she'd resented my perfect record, never realizing it came at the cost of being truly seen. We sat for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting together with the honesty heavy in the air. I told them about the therapy sessions I'd begun in Seattle, about how common these patterns were, how so many families unconsciously repeat what they themselves lived through as children. I shared stories from the support group at the community center, the eldest sons who carried the weight of absent fathers, the daughters who became caretakers before they finished high school, the siblings whose silent rivalry masked a deeper longing for connection. These weren't just my stories. They belonged to countless others, proof that our pain wasn't unique or shameful. It was simply human. If there's a lesson I learned in those hours, it's this: when you name your pain, you give others permission to confront their own. Speaking the truth doesn't guarantee an instant fix. My family still had miles to go, and some wounds would take years to fully heal. But honesty cracked open the door to something new, the possibility of real understanding. For the first time, I wasn't carrying my grief alone. I saw my parents as people with regrets and blind spots, not just as the source of my hurt. I saw Julia not as a rival, but as another daughter shaped by the same imperfect love. The silence that had once protected us now felt like a prison we no longer needed. By breaking it, I felt lighter, less afraid, more at home in my own skin. And as the rain finally stopped, streaks of sunlight reached through the window, painting our living room in soft gold. It seemed almost poetic, a quiet reminder that storms too can pass, that the truth, even when it hurts, can clear a space for something gentler to grow. Of course not. Every conversation ended so neatly. In the days that followed, my family sometimes slipped back into old habits, misunderstandings, flared apologies, stalled, and there were moments I wondered if we'd really changed at all. But every time I started to retreat into silence, I remembered Aunt Susan's words and my own resolve to be seen. The work of healing, I realized, isn't about never hurting again. It's about refusing to pretend you're okay when you're not. As I looked at my family, still a little battered but newly honest, I understood the next challenge would be learning how to help in a way that didn't erase me. The boundaries I'd set were still fragile, but now they were backed by the truth, by the courage to speak, and the willingness to listen. What remained was the delicate task of helping my family not out of guilt or duty, but out of genuine care on terms that honored us all. And that I discovered was the real beginning not just of healing for me, but for the family I was finally helping to reshape. There's a moment in every family crisis when the urge to fix everything collides with the need to protect yourself. After breaking the silence with my family, I felt both relief and vulnerability, as if I'd stepped outside without armor for the first time in years. My parents were grateful for my honesty, and Julia, though still hurting, seemed more willing to listen. But the practical questions remained: bills to pay, calls to make, decisions no one felt ready to face. All eyes turned to me, the capable daughter, as if speaking my truth meant I was now ready to shoulder every burden. This time I knew I had to help differently. The old pattern, rushing in, emptying my savings, trying to save everyone, was a road I refused to travel again. That decision didn't come easy. There's a subtle pressure, especially in families, to prove your love with sacrifice. In American culture, we talk a lot about helping out, but less about what happens when that help turns into silent martyrdom. I remembered stories from my community center support group, people who'd loaned money to relatives and never seen it again, or who'd put their own lives on hold to solve problems they didn't create. One friend, Maria, lost her college fund covering her brother's debts, only to find herself struggling years later while he bounced back quickly. The lesson was clear: help, yes, but do it wisely in a way that respects both your loved ones and yourself. So I sat down with my family, a pad of paper and pen in hand, and outlined what I could offer. I would help organize their finances, find a reputable credit counselor, and assist Julia in making a budget to pay back what she could. I could not and would not drain my own savings to erase everyone else's mistakes. The money I'd put away was hard-won long nights at work, sacrifices of my own dreams, for a future I wasn't willing to give up. My parents looked uncertain, and Julia's eyes filled with disappointment. "So you're just going to let us fail?" she asked quietly. I shook my head. "I'm giving you the tools to recover, not a shortcut through the pain. You have to walk this path yourselves." Of course, setting conditions for kindness is not the same as withholding love. It's about believing in others' capacity to grow, to learn from hard times, and to rise again. I made it clear I was there for emotional support, for practical guidance, for every tough conversation they needed. But the safety net they wanted, the one that would make all the hard consequences disappear, was not mine to weave. My therapist called this loving detachment a way of helping, without becoming entangled in someone else's choices. It's a lesson I wish I'd learned sooner, one that might have spared me years of quiet resentment and exhaustion. Helping on your terms also means being clear up front about expectations. For my family, I wrote everything down: what I would do, what I couldn't, and what I hoped they would take responsibility for themselves. We researched credit counseling agencies together, compared options for debt consolidation, and made a list of monthly expenses. I helped Julia draft emails to potential employers and reviewed her resume, with her pointing out the strengths she sometimes forgot she had. With my parents, we discussed which bills were urgent, which could wait, and how to negotiate with creditors. It was painstaking work, often fraught with anxiety and frustration, but for the first time, everyone was part of the process, not just me. This approach wasn't always met with gratitude. There were moments of anger, of blame, of old patterns rearing their heads. My father grumbled that family helps no matter what, and my mother worried about appearances, fretted that our neighbors might hear about our troubles. Julia sometimes sulked, wishing for the easy rescue that had always come before. But each time I stood firm. This isn't about punishment, I told them, it's about learning. We don't grow if someone else keeps cleaning up our messes. Over time, small shifts appeared. Julia found a part-time job, my parents started cooking at home to save money, and everyone took turns researching resources. It was slow, imperfect progress, but it belonged to all of us. Looking back, I see now that conditional kindness is actually a deeper kind of faith, a belief in someone's ability to struggle and survive. My parents, raised in a culture that equated love with sacrifice, began to see that letting me have boundaries didn't mean I loved them less. Julia, who once measured love by how quickly I could swoop in and save her, started to appreciate my presence in ways that went beyond money. She even told me one night as we walked through the quiet neighborhood I know now that you believe in me, even if it means letting me fail sometimes. It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had. If you've ever struggled with helping a loved one, know this true kindness is not about rescuing people from consequences, but about standing with them as they face those consequences head-on. It's about saying, I believe in your strength, even when it would be easier to fix things yourself. The hardest part, of course, is accepting that you can't control the outcome, but you can choose how you show up and on what terms. With each day, our family slowly adjusted to this new way of supporting each other. It wasn't perfect, and sometimes it felt lonely to hold my line. But my heart felt lighter, and my hope for all of us grew stronger. By refusing to lose myself in the crisis, I gave everyone, including myself, a chance to become more resilient, more honest, and more free. As the dust settled and routines returned, I sensed it was time for me to step back further, to let my family test their own strength, and for me to finally begin building the life I'd put on hold for so long. The next step would be just as important and just as daunting, learning to live as someone who is not only helpful, but whole, a person whose worth isn't measured by what she gives away, but by who she is, even when she lets go. In the weeks after setting my boundaries, I discovered that the hardest part wasn't the decision itself, but living with how others reacted. The backlash came quietly, at first a longer silence from my father over breakfast, a sharp glance from my mother Julia's lingering sighs as she scrolled through her phone. I felt it everywhere in the way my family paused when I walked into a room and the slight tension in every conversation. But then came the comments, subtle at first, then more direct. "You've changed him," my father said one evening, as if it were an accusation. My mother's words stung even more. "You used to be so caring. Now you just seem cold." I had expected some disappointment, but nothing prepared me for how isolating it felt to be labeled unfeeling by the very people I loved most. There's an old saying that guilt is the price we pay for freedom. I understood it in a new way now. For years, my identity was built around being the helper, the comforter, the one who smoothed over every conflict and filled every gap. Saying no to that role felt like a betrayal, not just of my family, but of the person I'd always believed myself to be. The guilt was real and relentless. Showing up in small ways, I apologized for things that weren't my fault, offered to do more, even after I'd said I wouldn't lay awake at night, replaying every hard conversation. It was as if every no carried the weight of 100 old expectations whispering that I was selfish for choosing myself. But slowly I began to see that guilt, while uncomfortable, is not always a sign that you're doing something wrong. Sometimes it's simply the feeling that arises when you start to break old patterns, especially those that never really served you. In my support group, I met others who had been labeled cold or distant for protecting their boundaries. There was Tom, a quiet father of 3 who stopped lending money to relatives who never paid him back and was promptly called heartless. There was Leah, who refused to pick up extra shifts at her job and watched coworkers mutter behind her back. Each story echoed my own, the struggle to claim your own life and the backlash that so often follows. It helped to talk with my therapist, Dr. Nguyen, who gently reframed my experience. "You're not responsible for other people's feelings about your boundaries," she reminded me. "The discomfort you feel is a sign of growth, not failure." She suggested practical ways to cope: journaling, reaching out to friends who understood, and reminding myself that I was allowed to put my needs first. I started making a list each night, not of what I'd done for others, but of small ways I'd honored my own well-being. Some days it was as simple as taking a quiet walk. Other days it was letting myself cry without shame. Each act of self-compassion was a step toward healing, even when it felt unfamiliar. There were moments, of course, when the guilt nearly pulled me back. After Julia's car broke down, she called, her voice trembling, asking if I'd co-sign a loan. For a moment, I wanted to say yes, just to hear relief in her voice, just to prove I wasn't as cold as everyone said. But I paused, took a breath, and gently explained why I couldn't. Julia hung up angry, and I felt the old ache settle in my chest. But that night, I didn't apologize or backtrack. I let the discomfort pass through me, trusting that with time, Julia would find her own way. In doing so, I discovered a strange new freedom, the freedom to live with someone's disappointment without letting it dictate my choices. There's a lesson I wish I'd learned sooner, that no is a complete sentence, and sometimes it's the kindest word you can offer. Families especially have a way of making love, conditional, measured in sacrifices and silent agreements. But real love, I've learned, makes room for boundaries. It allows each person to be responsible for their own happiness, their own failures, and their own growth. In letting go of the need to be everything to everyone, I found space to become myself, not perfect, not always understood, but whole in ways I'd never been before. In time, the backlash softened. My parents, still unsure, began to respect my choices in small ways my father asked. Before assuming I'd take on another task, my mother learned to listen without immediate judgment. Julia, though still struggling, stopped asking for things she knew I couldn't give. The change wasn't instant, or even dramatic, but it was real. Most importantly, I felt less afraid of being misunderstood. The more I practiced saying no, the more confident I became in saying yes to things that brought me peace, joy, and genuine connection. If you are walking a similar path, if you've been called cold for refusing to lose yourself, know that you are not alone. The world often rewards those who give endlessly, but it is the brave ones who learn to say enough. It takes courage to withstand the discomfort, to sit with the guilt, and to trust that your needs matter too. The freedom that follows is not just for you, but for everyone you love, because when you are whole, you give from a place of abundance, not depletion. As I settled into this new chapter, I realized my journey was not just about setting boundaries, but about building a life beyond them, a life where I could support my family without losing myself, and where my own happiness was finally allowed to take root. The next step, I knew, was to discover who I was outside the role of helper, to build a future shaped not by guilt, but by hope and self-discovery. Reclaiming my boundaries felt like stepping onto new ground, unsteady, but brimming with possibility. With time, the tension at home loosened, and I realized I was free to design my days in ways I'd never dared before. It started small, a quiet breakfast at my favorite cafe in Boston, the sun streaming through the window as I read a novel for no one but myself. I signed up for a yoga class at the community center and let my breath fill spaces I'd spent years keeping empty. It was the first time I'd listened to my own needs, not just the echo of someone else's crisis. Each gentle routine was a vote for a different future, a future where my well-being mattered not as a reward for sacrifice, but as a birthright. My new independence felt awkward at first. For years, my value had been measured by my usefulness, so unstructured time made me uneasy. I remember the first weekend I spent alone, resisting the urge to call home or check in on Julia's progress. I baked banana bread, made a mess of my tiny kitchen, and laughed when the loaf came out lopsided. It was imperfect, and mine a moment of joy unburdened by obligation. Gradually, I reconnected with old friends, inviting them over for potlucks and long conversations. Some days, I still caught myself worrying, was I missing a family emergency? But each time I chose presence over panic, I strengthened my trust in the life I was building. Seeking purpose beyond my family, I volunteered as a mentor for First Gen Women in Tech, a program for young women starting their college journeys. On my first evening with the group, I was nervous what wisdom could I possibly offer, but as I listened to their stories of imposter syndrome and feeling overlooked, I saw pieces of myself in each of them. One mentee, Tara, shared how she always put her siblings' needs above her own, afraid to ask for help in case she was seen as selfish. Another, Brianna, described the pressure to be perfect because her parents worked so hard to give her opportunities. I offered strategies from my own experience, setting gentle boundaries, scheduling time for rest, learning to celebrate small victories. More than anything, I tried to create a space where their voices would be heard. The power of support, I discovered, is not about having all the answers. Sometimes it's simply holding space for someone to stumble, to speak, to try again. As weeks passed, I watched the mentees encourage one another. Tara finally asked her professor for an extension. Brianna attended a networking event despite her fears. The victories weren't always dramatic, but they were real phone calls about landing an internship, emails celebrating a past exam, text messages full of relief after difficult conversations with family. Their growth reminded me that healing isn't linear. It's a mosaic of small risks, honest dialogue, and the permission to be more than just the strong one. Through mentoring, I realized how vital it is to build communities where everyone is allowed to thrive, not just survive. The support I offered others deepened my own healing. When I shared my old mistakes or lingering doubts, the mentees listened without judgment. In their company, I felt less alone and more whole. It struck me that sometimes the best way to reclaim your story is by helping others rewrite theirs. In doing so, you discover new dimensions of your own resilience and capacity for joy. Life beyond survival meant experimenting with joy in unexpected places. I adopted a rescue cat named Willow, whose gentle purrs filled the quiet corners of my apartment. I planted a small herb garden on my windowsill, marveling at how quickly green shoots found their way to the light. Some days, I volunteered at the community kitchen, serving meals to neighbors who'd lost jobs or housing during hard times. There, I met people whose struggles dwarfed my own, and yet who radiated hope and humor. Each interaction reminded me fulfillment doesn't come from fixing everything for others, but from being present, kind, and willing to connect. I also started therapy again, not because I was broken, but because I was curious about who I could become when I wasn't busy patching up everyone else's wounds. Dr. Nguyen challenged me to notice the stories I still carried about worth, guilt, and love, and to question which ones I wanted to keep. Together, we mapped new ways of relating: how to accept praise without deflection, how to ask for help, how to rest without apology. These skills, once foreign, became tools for building a self-sustaining happiness. A lesson emerged: gentle but persistent growth isn't selfish, it's necessary. When you model self-care and healthy boundaries, you give others permission to do the same. In my new friendships and through mentoring, I saw how each act of honesty and self-kindness rippled outward, touching lives in ways I couldn't predict. Even Julia from afar began to update me on her progress, not with desperation, but with pride in her own small victories. Our relationship found a new footing, no longer defined by crisis, but by mutual respect. As I walked home one evening, after a community event, arms full of wildflowers from a mentee, I realized this was the life I'd been craving all along, a life rooted in connection, purpose, and authenticity. I no longer defined myself by what I could endure for others, but by what I could build, nurture, and share. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that happiness was not a distant reward, but something to be cultivated every day. The next chapter, I knew, would challenge me to expand this newfound sense of belonging, not just with friends or mentees, but in the community I chose to call home. If I could find family in unlikely places, perhaps I could help others do the same. It was time to explore what belonging truly meant and how to redefine home on my own terms. As the months passed, the contours of my world began to shift. With every step I took away from old patterns, I found myself drawn toward people who valued the messy, authentic parts of life. At first, I hesitated to call this new constellation of friends, mentors, and neighbors family. The word itself had always carried the weight of blood ties and obligation, the bittersweet ache of wanting to belong, but never quite fitting in. But in the spaces where laughter spilled across dinner tables, where texts arrived just to say thinking of you, and where help was offered without strings, I felt something familiar and startling, a sense of home blooming where I least expected it. I began to see that chosen family is not a consolation prize for those who've lost their way with relatives. Instead, it's a conscious act of hope, a way of surrounding yourself with people who respect your boundaries, celebrate your quirks, and show up when it matters most. My friend Rachel, who I met through the community kitchen, would drop off a loaf of homemade bread just because she'd baked too much. Layla, my old college roommate, became the one I called after hard days, her easy laughter a reminder that joy could be found even in struggle. These friendships were woven through with understanding and respect. There was no pressure to be perfect, no risk of love being withheld for setting limits. One night, I hosted a small gathering in my apartment, stringing fairy lights across the ceiling and letting music play softly in the background. My guests brought stories as well as food potluck dinners with dishes from childhood spent in cities and countries far from mine. As we shared our favorite memories, a new feeling settled over me, acceptance without conditions. No one cared whether I had always made the right choices, whether I'd sacrificed enough. They valued the version of me that showed up, sometimes tired, sometimes goofy, always real. It struck me that this was the heart of belonging, to be loved for who you are, not for the roles you perform. These new bonds didn't erase the ache of my old family's distance, but they softened it. Over time, Julia and I rebuilt a quieter, steadier connection. She updated me on her life in small bursts, a new job, a book she'd read, a recipe she'd mastered. There was no more pleading for rescue, just mutual respect for the journeys we each had taken. My parents, too, reached out occasionally, not with requests, but with genuine interest. They were learning in their own way to offer love without conditions. Healing, I realized, was not always about perfect reunions or grand apologies. Sometimes it's simply allowing space for everyone to grow, even if that growth takes them in separate directions. In the mentorship group, I encouraged the women to explore what home meant to them. Brianna shared how her group of friends became her safety net during her first year away from home. Tara described the relief of finally finding people who understood her struggles with cultural expectations. Family, we agreed, can be the people who witness your journey and choose to stay even when it's hard. These conversations reminded me that belonging is built, not inherited, and it's strengthened every time we risk honesty and ask for what we need. A lesson emerged as clear as the morning light: we all deserve spaces where our boundaries are honored and our voices are welcome. The love that grows in these chosen circles may look different from the storybook images of family, but it is no less real, no less powerful. In fact, it's often more durable, built on shared vulnerability rather than obligation. The warmth of a meal prepared together, the laughter after a long workday, the small, steady ways we show up for one another, these became the threads that wove my new sense of home. Of course, choosing your family doesn't mean closing your heart to those you were born to. There were times I still missed the old closeness with my parents, the holiday rituals of my childhood, the simple comfort of familiarity. But I learned to hold that grief gently without letting it dictate my happiness. In its place, I cultivated gratitude for what was possible, both with my family of origin and with the community I'd built. There was beauty in having both, in allowing myself to receive love in many forms, and in knowing I could choose where to invest my heart. As I looked around at the life I was building, mentoring, gardening, cooking with friends, exchanging handwritten notes, and spontaneous hugs, I saw how far I'd come from the girl who once believed love had to be earned. I learned that belonging starts within, with the decision to show up as yourself, to risk being seen and heard, and to trust that the right people will recognize your value. In opening my world to new connections, I found healing not just for myself, but for others who longed for the same sense of welcome. On a soft spring evening, as I watered the herbs on my windowsill, I felt a quiet peace settle in my chest. The longing for home that had followed me for so long had finally found its answer not in a perfect family, but in the tapestry of relationships I'd nurtured with care. The next chapter, I realized, was about sharing this lesson, offering hope and encouragement to others still searching for their place. Belonging, after all, is not just a gift you receive, it's one you can help create for yourself and for those brave enough to reach out. And so I stepped into each day ready to welcome what came next, carrying with me the love I'd chosen, the boundaries I'd protected, and the faith that home could be found and made wherever honest hearts gathered. Looking back, I'm amazed at the ground I've covered, from invisible daughter to a woman who stands firmly in her truth. Every chapter of my story began with a longing to be seen, a hunger for acceptance that led me first into the shadows and then into the hard, liberating work of stepping into the light. I learned that family is not just what you're given at birth, but what you build through boundaries, courage, and the gentle act of reaching out again and again, even after disappointment. The journey was never perfect. There were setbacks, relapses into old habits, and nights when loneliness echoed louder than hope. But each time I risked honesty, each time I stood by my boundaries, I reclaimed another piece of myself. All the lessons I've shared, the cost of invisibility, the strength it takes to say no, the beauty of building community, and the transformative power of chosen family, came together not as a tidy solution, but as a mosaic of healing. I found that growth is not about erasing old wounds, but about tending them with care, learning their shape, and understanding the stories they carry. Helping others became my way of helping myself. Through mentoring and volunteering, I rediscovered joy, not as a reward for sacrifice, but as a right. Even my relationship with my family of origin softened as I stopped seeking approval and started practicing acceptance both for them and for me. One truth shines brighter than all the rest: you are worthy of love, respect, and belonging exactly as you are. You do not have to earn your place by carrying every burden or by being everything to everyone. When you dare to put yourself first, not out of selfishness but out of self-respect, you give permission to everyone around you to do the same. Whether you find your family through blood friendship or the communities you choose, know that belonging starts from within. The journey home is always in some way a journey back to yourself. If my story resonated with you, if you've ever felt overlooked, struggled to set boundaries, or long to build a home where you're truly seen, I invite you to share your thoughts below. What part of this journey spoke to you most? Have you discovered your own chosen family or taken a leap toward healing? Your voice matters here, and your story could be the light someone else needs to begin their own. Before you go, please consider subscribing to this channel and liking this video. Every comment, like, and share helps us grow a community where honesty, compassion, and resilience are valued above all else. Your support allows more people to find the encouragement they need to stand tall and seek joy, no matter where they started. So let's keep this conversation going. Leave a comment, share your journey, and invite others to join us. Together, we can prove that even the quietest stories can take root, grow strong, and reach toward the sun. Thank you for listening and for daring in your own way to believe in the life you truly deserve.